Welcome back to this online brown bag series on Follies in fragile states. My name is Ian Quick and this is part 3 of 6. We are continuing our look at the Makeover Fantasy, the mismatch of the remedy that we tried to deliver in Eastern Congo and the underlying problem. We've seen that the remedy was wrong because the body rejected it. I described this attack at Kinyandoni in some detail to illustrate a hard fact. Efforts to deploy police, to build prisons, to arrest the bad guys met with popular resistance. And it was exactly the same pattern for initiatives to deal with land conflicts and return of displaced people. The question I want to turn to now is why. What was behind this? Why did our approach of restoring state authority, as we called it, meet this reaction? And I want to start that by driving a short distance to the south. This photo comes from the inauguration ceremony for a police station in Rutshuru town in early 2011. And there's the appearance of order here. There is a heavy use of the symbolic language of the rule of law. A neat receiving line for the VIPs who are coming. The rocks are whitewashed. There's a brass band at left. But if we scratch 1/8 of an inch below the surface here, all that begins to fall apart. Most obviously, at left of frame, this officer is holding a cheap plastic replica sword wrapped in tissue paper. At right, he's missing the numero de matricule, the identifying tag that should sit in that empty Velcro patch on his chest, as are all the other officers here. More subtly, only half these men have guns. If you know the physiognomy of Eastern DRC, it's not by accident which half. The building itself is not in shot because the building itself was still in a state of some disrepair, even on the day of its formal inauguration. And these are all clues to quite spectacular practical problems. It took several years to get this first police station up and running. We couldn't get land. Finding contractors was extraordinarily difficult. Once the unit was there, they constantly struggled to have adequate fuel for their vehicles, so they walked. They didn't have much training in counter guerrilla warfare, unsurprisingly, so they turned to the National Army, defeating the point of having police deployments. And all this despite quite extensive international support. Why was that? Well, the idea had been to invest heavily in sensitive areas, to build islands of stability, as they were called at one stage. But it turned out that you can't take just a few pieces of the puzzle in isolation from all the others. This unit of 60 men in Rutshuru is part of a very large institution, the National Congolese Police, which had been assembled just a few years before, and it was a hodgepodge of different elements. Former rebels, loyalists to President Kabila, loyalists to the old guard before Kabila, local militias, new recruits untainted by that rather sordid history at bottom left here. And that new entity, the new national police, was not well consolidated. At the same time, we were asking it to do something very, very difficult and start up operations in a part of the country where the police had never really operated effectively, historically. All that equipment needed spare parts and maintenance. Those shortwave radios needed to connect to processors for support and rapid response. The team on the ground needed the right local languages and the right local knowledge. These are all complicated systems that have to work over long distances and across those tremendous internal political divides. On the ground, then, the real picture looked more like this. Ad hoc facilities, tents, UN-branded equipment that mocked the notion that it was the Congolese government that was exercising control and enjoyed legitimacy. Out of frame, out the back of these tents, more telling still, you would find small farms, often local families as well. Because these units managed to get by, they managed to survive on their own, but with very little support, very little effective support from the central state. When it came to people who had more clout, notably judges, senior administrators, we simply couldn't get them there. Firstly, because they're a scarce resource nationally, and secondly, because their parent institutions had almost zero experience of sustaining them in these areas, and particularly in the more remote areas. So this is problem A with the state authority approach. We were trying to build a second story or a third story on a house whose foundations were terribly, terribly weak. Now, the structure stayed up with enough workarounds, enough extraordinary support, but you certainly couldn't live in it. The institution simply couldn't take the weight that we were asking it to bear. For problem B with this approach, I want to take you back to the 1960s. This quote comes from a Kinshasa newspaper, and it was put there by the Mobutu government in reference to this very same area of Rutshuru. And what was going on is that the Congolese government was flush with cash. This was around the time of the copper boom, and it was trying its strength against the customary chiefs that had always exercised a great deal of influence in this part of the country. In 1973 to 4, we see a number of attempts to curtail the power of these chiefs, setting criteria for how they were selected, trying to rotate them, removing their customary police forces, setting up a new system for registration of land. And what's striking is that all of these attempts were essentially abandoned by the end of 74. In this contest between the central government and these older local institutions as to who had authority, who had legitimacy in these areas, it was a definitive loss for Mobutu. This pattern continued once he eventually fell. During the Second Congo War, a group called the RCDG controlled this area. It tried to establish police and administrations of its own, and these were resisted. They were resisted because they were blatantly operating in very narrow interests, and often foreign, Rwandan interests. Minor attacks like the one we saw at Kinyandoni were very, very common through this period. This pattern continues itself over the following decades. The RCDG morphs into the CNDP into the M23. Some of the faces of the resistance during that time are here. This is a group called the APCLS, Patriots for a Free and Sovereign Congo. This is a Hyundai militia that formed in large part to resist land grabs by those groups that I just mentioned. And I have to credit International Alert and a project called Local Voices for these photos. The point I want to emphasize is there are police and military wings. Both are sporting the appropriate uniforms, these leopard skin pants notwithstanding. And the police wing did exercise police functions. It was blatantly parochial, of course, but it was preferred to police forces that were seen as foreign or outsider. So after all of this history, what happened when we tried to introduce yet another flavor of state authority, yet another set of men in police uniforms trying to enforce the rules? Well, to find out, let's go back to Masisi. I showed you this slide in part 2 as one of our centerpieces for marketing stabilization efforts. And it looks impressive. With some effort, we polished it and formally inaugurated these facilities in 2011. And that went well. You can see the inspection tour of a UN bigwig at bottom right. But for the real test, we have to flash forward a few months in time. And by August of that year, the provincial police commander wanted to change the command appointment in Masisi town. He appointed a gentleman by the name of Colonel Zabuloni as the territory chief. When he went to take up his appointment, however, he was met by a barricade across the road. Atop the barricade was the existing police chief, Colonel Gilbert. He was backed by his detachment of armed police, 30-40 men, and several dozen locals, amply plied with liquor and getting a bit agitated. So quite an ugly scene, and Zabuloni backed down, not willing to test his strength at that moment. What was going on here? One of the most succinct explanations of this that I've seen is from a guy by the name of Johann Beck. And he maps here the elaborate legal or paper structure for regulating disputes over land, and then notes, quite elegantly in a way, that armed groups simply exerted pressure at whichever points were necessary to get the outcomes they wanted. And this is a phenomenon that's quite easy to map empirically. It's been done in detail for land and for the mineral trade in particular. And what we saw in that incident in Masisi was exactly this dynamic playing out. This is the territorial administrator, Marie-Claire. She'd fled the scene as soon as Zabuloni started to make his way there. And the reason for this was that she had a certain scope of legal authority. But once Zabuloni was in town with his 60-plus armed men, he would clearly have the opportunity to pressure her and how that was influenced. More concerningly, behind Zabuloni, it was well known, was this man. This is Bosco Ntaganda, and from the increasing quality of the photos, you can tell that he's a bit more of an international celebrity, in fact, on trial at the International Criminal Court. And he was a leading light of the CNDP movement, which had reached a peace agreement with the government, but was notorious for using its muscle for large-scale land appropriation, illegal taxation, securing senior appointments. So, Gilbert's faction and the APCLS, who we saw earlier, who had similar interests in this case, resisted. They were not about to put their faith in the uniform that Zabuloni would act within the rules, not with 20 years' experience directly to the contrary. So the takeaway from all this, the conclusion, that theory that strengthening state authority would solve the problem kind of missed the point of politics. It was not a question of more or less men on the ground. It was really a question of who they were and whose agenda they were supporting. Now, to illustrate this, I want to jump to a very different context. This is Ferguson, Missouri, in the United States. And the photos are from a series in Wired magazine on the Black Lives Matter movement, a series of civic protests following the killing of a number of young black men in very dubious circumstances. And the idea that this moment of crisis in the US could be resolved through deploying more police was ludicrous. It was manifestly about repairing trust and credibility between police services on the one hand and the population, and more specifically the black population on the other hand. That was and remains a slow and very, very contentious process, for the simple fact that there's 50 years of post-segregation history in the background, and really several centuries of wider tensions before that. If we need larger scale examples, they're not hard to find. Post-apartheid police in South Africa, Irish Home Rule after independence, Greece or Spain after the fascists, Argentina after Pinochet. With the benefit of hindsight, these were all very slow processes of rebuilding the foundations, and they took generations to get broadly right, a process that is still ongoing in many cases. So this is the cruel irony of the Makeover Fantasy. We recognize the need for sensitivity and caution and painstaking dialogue in a context like Ferguson, but we disregard it in fragile states. We disregard the need for caution in an environment where all politics is real politics. Entire communities risk displacement, mass atrocities when they get the calculus wrong. That wraps up part 3. Next up is part 4, geography denial, which moves us from the historical dimension to the physical. 70 million people, 2.5 million square kilometers. What do you do? How do you set your ambitions? So please click through, and thank you for listening.